September 10, 1944. Somewhere in liberated Belgium, a decision was made behind closed doors that would shape the outcome of the largest airborne operation in human history. General Dwight D. Eisenhower approved a plan that stripped the most battle-hardened airborne commander the Allies possessed of his rightful authority, and handed it to a man who had never once commanded troops in combat. The man left standing on the outside was Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway. Was it pride? And did that single decision turn a potential Allied triumph into a devastating, costly failure? By September 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had produced something close to euphoria at Supreme Headquarters. Paris had fallen. Brussels had been liberated. The German military, which had seemed invincible just 3 years earlier, appeared to be fracturing at the seams. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, believed the moment had arrived for a decisive, concentrated thrust directly into Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, before Hitler could rebuild his shattered defenses. What he proposed was breathtaking in its ambition and brutally compressed in its timeline. The plan was called Operation Market Garden, and it was, in Montgomery's own words, the blow that could end the war by Christmas 1944. It called for 35,000 airborne soldiers to drop from the sky across a 60-mile corridor of Dutch countryside, seizing 7 major bridges over canals and rivers in sequence from Eindhoven to Nijmegen to Arnhem. Once those bridges were held, Britain's armored 33rd Corps would race northward up a single highway, cross the lower Rhine at Arnhem, and sweep into Germany from the north. In theory, the Siegfried Line would be bypassed entirely. In theory. Now here is where history gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the man best qualified to execute this operation was not given command of it. Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway had spent 3 years building the American Airborne Arm from nothing. He had converted a standard infantry division into the 82nd Airborne, the first formation of its kind in the United States Army. He had jumped into Sicily with his men in July 1943. He had parachuted into Normandy on the night of June 5th, fought 33 consecutive days in the hedgerows, and buried thousands of his soldiers along the way. In August 1944, he had been elevated to command the 18th Airborne Corps, a 3-division formation comprising the 82nd, the 101st, and the newly arriving 17th Airborne Division. His was the most experienced airborne corps in the Allied order of battle. Then, in late August 1944, command of the 1st Allied Airborne Army passed to General Louis H. Brereton, a U.S. Air Force general who had spent the war flying strategic bombing missions and had virtually no background in ground combat or airborne operations. Brereton's deputy was the British Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, a charismatic figure who had helped pioneer British airborne thinking, but who had never once exercised tactical command of troops in an actual battle. And when the time came to assign operational command for Market Garden, the most complex airborne operation ever attempted, that command went to Browning, not Ridgway. Consider what this decision actually meant in military terms. 3/4 of the soldiers who would fight in Market Garden were American men from Ridgway's own 18th Airborne Corps. The 82nd Airborne Division under the newly promoted Brigadier General James Gavin and the 101st Airborne under Major General Maxwell Taylor would collectively account for over 20,000 paratroopers and glidermen dropping into Holland. Their corps commander, Ridgway, with more verified combat experience in airborne operations than any other general in the Allied chain of command, was excluded from directing a single one of them once the shooting started. His headquarters was left in reserve while Browning's administrative staff, a planning organization that had never once coordinated a live battle, was given command of forces it could not even communicate with. The primary scholarly repository for Market Garden documentation records directly that Ridgway was vastly the more experienced option, and he was bitterly disappointed to have been overlooked, not least because the majority of the airborne troops involved in Market Garden were American. And the practical consequence of Browning's appointment was almost immediately apparent. His headquarters had no communications equipment capable of reaching the 2 American divisions it was theoretically commanding. American signalmen and their radios had to be improvised and attached at the last minute, a logistical scramble that no professional military planner should have allowed in the final hours before the largest airborne operation in history. There is a question that military historians have been asking for 80 years, and it does not get easier with time. What would have happened if Ridgway had been given command? It is not an idle speculation. It is a question grounded in the documented record of a man who, weeks earlier, had personally walked 1.5 miles down a Dutch road that British armored vehicles refused to drive, and reached the conclusion that stronger leadership could have saved an entire airborne division from destruction. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to 1943 for a moment, because understanding who Matthew Ridgway was requires understanding the test that revealed his character most clearly. In September of that year, Allied Command devised Operation Giant II, a plan to drop the entire 82nd Airborne Division near Rome, in support of an Italian uprising against German forces, just hours before the Salerno landings. Ridgway examined the plan and concluded it was, in his own recorded words, exceptionally unsound. The division would land beyond the range of any Allied air cover, between two German armored divisions, with no ground relief possible. He believed it would result in the death or capture of most of his men. Rather than comply in silence, Ridgway carried his objections up the chain of command from General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, to General Harold Alexander, the Allied ground commander. He argued with precision and with evidence, and he kept arguing until Alexander was persuaded to send Ridgway's own artillery commander, Brigadier General Maxwell Taylor, on a covert mission through German-held lines to Rome to verify the Italian cooperation firsthand. Taylor's report confirmed that the Italian forces were in no position to support the operation. Giant II was canceled just hours before the first aircraft were scheduled to take off. Ridgway had saved his entire division from a catastrophic mission through professional courage and stubborn, documented insistence. This pattern of identifying a flawed plan, challenging it through proper channels, and being proven right by events was not accidental. It was the defining characteristic of a commander who had spent years watching what happened when generals stayed silent to protect their careers. The Sicily Airborne Operation of July 1943 had been nearly catastrophic, with transport aircraft flying through Allied naval gunfire and paratroopers scattered across 50 miles of Sicilian countryside. Ridgway had conducted rigorous after-action analysis, fought to preserve the airborne concept against those who wanted to disband the divisions, and rebuilt doctrine from the ground up. By the time Market Garden was being planned, he was the most credible voice on airborne warfare in the Allied command, and he was being frozen out, and then came Normandy. On the night of June 5, 1944, while most of the world was holding its breath for the greatest amphibious landing ever attempted, Matthew Ridgway jumped from a transport aircraft into the darkness over the Cotentin Peninsula in France. He was not required to jump. He was a corps-level commander by that point, a 3-star general whose responsibilities were strategic, not tactical. He jumped anyway. He spent 33 consecutive days in combat, coordinating the advance of the 82nd Airborne from Saint-Mary-Église westward towards Cherbourg, absorbing losses that would have broken a lesser formation. The division suffered more than 5,000 casualties. Ridgway attended to them all. By August 1944, when the first Allied Airborne Army was formally established and Ridgway was elevated to command the 18th Airborne Corps, he carried inside him a record that no other general in that command structure could match. He had fought in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the subsequent breakout. He had personally challenged a suicidal plan and saved his division. He had jumped into combat when he did not have to. And now, in September 1944, as the largest airborne operation in history was being assembled, the Allied command structure made the decision that would echo through every history book written about this operation. They put someone else in charge. The official record, preserved in the 18th Airborne Corps history and verified by the Warfare History Network, states plainly that the decision to place Browning in command, rather than Ridgway, was the result of a political accommodation between the American and British commands, and that it produced 3 immediate structural problems. First, 3/4 of the fighting troops were American. Second, Ridgway's combat experience in airborne operations was far superior. Third, Browning's headquarters was not a battlefield command organization. It had no battle-tested communications infrastructure, no established relationships with the American divisions it was supposed to direct, and no experience of the controlled chaos that defines an airborne operation from the moment the first parachute opens. Remember that question from the opening. Was this a political decision rather than a military one? The answer, drawn from the documented historical record, is yes. And as September 17th, 1944, approached, the morning 35,000 men would lift off from airfields across England and descend from the sky into Holland. Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway remained exactly where Allied politics had placed him. Off to the side, without command. Watching the operation he was most qualified to lead being handed to a man who had never directed a soldier in battle. What happened next changed the war, and it began at 9:45 in the morning when the first transport aircraft crossed the Dutch coast. September 17, 1944, 9:45 in the morning. The sky over Holland turned gray with aircraft. In what remains the largest single-day airborne deployment in the history of warfare, over 1,600 transport planes and gliders descended toward 3 separate drop zones spread across 60 miles of occupied Dutch countryside. For a moment, just a moment, it must have seemed to the people looking up from the streets of Eindhoven and Nijmegen and Arnhem that the war was ending. It was not ending. For 10,000 Allied soldiers, it was only beginning. The American part of the operation worked. That is the fact that 80 years of popular history have consistently buried beneath the story of British failure at Arnhem. Brigadier General James Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division secured the Wall River Bridge at Nijmegen against fierce resistance, a river crossing that military planners had considered among the most dangerous in the entire operation. Major General Maxwell Taylor's 101st Airborne held the corridor between Eindhoven and Veghel against relentless German counterattacks for days on end. These were not supporting roles. They were the spine of the entire operation, and they held. As for Ridgway himself, he was present. He flew into Holland, he drove the roads, he walked the landscape of the operation that was supposed to be under his command, and in doing so, he witnessed something that would define his judgment of Market Garden for the rest of his life. According to the account preserved in American Heritage's definitive 1976 profile of Ridgway, drawing on his own testimony, he found that he could personally walk 1.5 miles down a Dutch road that an advance element of British armored vehicles was unwilling to try. He walked it, on foot, a 3-star general, alone, on a road that a column of armored vehicles machines designed to absorb fire had refused to move down. From that single observed moment, Ridgway drew a conclusion that he stated clearly and without ambiguity in his December 1944 after-action report, a document preserved in the historical record and cited by the Warfare History Network. Stronger leadership from the top command, he concluded, could have brought British ground forces into contact with the 1st British Airborne Division, stranded beyond the Rhine at Arnhem. He did not make this claim in anger. He made it with the cold precision of a professional who had spent 3 years learning exactly what aggressive ground leadership looked like, and he had just spent days watching its absence. Now consider the commanders who were in charge. Frederick Browning, the British officer who held operational command of all airborne forces in Market Garden, ran his headquarters from Nijmegen, 19 miles south of Arnhem, where the 1st British Airborne Division was fighting for survival. His communications with the American divisions were so poor that he was effectively directing an operation he could not see, with tools he could not use. The Armchair General magazine's detailed retrospective drawing on multiple peer-reviewed military histories states directly that neither Brereton nor Browning were inclined to heed advice from their more experienced subordinate airborne commanders, and that those subordinates included Ridgway, Gavin, Taylor, and Polish Brigade Commander Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski. Sosabowski had said it plainly before the operation even began. At a planning conference in early September, the Polish commander told Browning directly and in recorded testimony that the plan cannot possibly succeed and that it would be suicide for the forces assigned to it. Browning took offense. The British intelligence officer who produced aerial reconnaissance photographs showing German armor repositioning near Arnhem was removed from duty and ordered to rest. The warnings from Montgomery's own intelligence chief about increasing German strength in the area were noted and set aside. The ultra-signals intelligence that confirmed 2 SS Panzer divisions refitting near the drop zones was acknowledged and then consciously discounted. This is the misconception that has shaped popular understanding of Market Garden for 8 decades, and it is worth confronting directly. The common telling places all blame for the failure at Arnhem on bad weather, bad luck, and the unexpected presence of SS Panzer forces. But the documented record tells a different story. The SS Panzer forces were not unexpected. They were reported, confirmed by ultra-intelligence, and dismissed. The warnings from subordinate commanders were not absent. They were delivered, recorded, and ignored. The failure was not primarily a product of circumstance. It was a product of a command culture in which the most experienced voices were systematically excluded from the decisions that mattered most. Had Ridgway held operational command, what would have been different? The answer, derived from his documented behavior across 3 years of airborne operations, is specific. Ridgway had personally challenged the Giant II plan in 1943 and canceled it. He had been the first to walk a road in Holland that armored commanders would not drive. He had spent years insisting that airborne formations be employed according to proven doctrine, never drop too far from their objectives, always with a credible plan for ground relief within 48 hours. The 1st British Airborne Division at Arnhem was dropped 8 miles from the bridge it was supposed to seize, with no plan for relief that could realistically arrive within 8 hours, let alone 48. Every one of those decisions ran directly counter to the principles that Ridgway had been advocating, documenting, and fighting for since 1943. By September 21st, 4 days into the operation, the 1st British Airborne Division at Arnhem was encircled and running short of ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Relief from XVIII Corps, still grinding up the single-lane highway from the south, was not coming fast enough. The bridge at Arnhem, a bridge too far, as one British officer memorably described it, was being lost. Over 10,000 Allied soldiers had been committed to the far end of a 60-mile corridor, and the corridor was being cut. The American divisions held their ground. The 82nd Airborne held Nijmegen. The 101st Airborne held the corridor. They did what they were asked to do, but the operation's fundamental architecture, a single road, a command structure without communications, drop zones placed far from objectives, intelligence warnings dismissed, had already determined the outcome. When the withdrawal finally came on the night of September 25th, roughly 2,400 soldiers of the 1st British Airborne Division were evacuated back across the Rhine. Roughly 8,000 had been killed, wounded, or captured. The operation had produced over 17,000 total Allied casualties. Ridgway filed his formal assessment in December 1944. The document, preserved in the Historical Archive and analyzed by Ridgway's notebook, a scholarly publication specializing in Ridgway's primary source records, contains this precisely worded judgment. The measure of success of this operation must be appreciated under the pitiless light of cold-blooded analysis, lest these magnificent divisions be assigned a task wholly beyond their strength. I cannot too strongly urge the study, the mastery, and the application by all upon whom devolves any degree of responsibility for the employment of airborne forces. He was not celebrating. He was not grandstanding. He was documenting for the record, for the history books, for the next generation of commanders who would have to learn from what had just happened. 3 months later, Ridgway was commanding his 18th Airborne Corps through the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land battle in American military history after Eisenhower released his corps from theater reserve on December 18th, 3 days into the German Ardennes offensive. His units stabilized the northern shoulder of the Allied line. Then, in March 1945, he led those same troops in Operation Varsity, the last major airborne operation of the war, crossing the Rhine into Germany on the 24th. He was wounded by a grenade fragment during the operation. He continued commanding. Was the decision to sideline Ridgway political rather than military? Yes, by every measure the record provides. Did that decision contribute to the failure at Arnhem? Yes, in the structural sense of producing a command architecture that was incapable of executing the operation with the aggressiveness and adaptability that the situation demanded. And was Ridgway, in the end, vindicated? Not loudly, not ceremonially, but completely. He went on to save the United States Army in Korea, replace Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander of UN forces, and succeed Eisenhower himself as Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He lived to 98 years old, and he spent much of his later life making sure the American contribution to Market Garden was finally understood. General Louis Brereton, who commanded the 1st Allied Airborne Army, wrote shortly after the operation, "In the years to come, everyone will remember Arnhem, but no one will remember that 2 American divisions fought their hearts out in the Dutch Canal country." Sadly, that prediction was accurate for decades. Cornelius Ryan's 1974 book, A Bridge Too Far, and the 1977 film adaptation finally began to correct the record. Ridgway himself, according to the American Heritage Profile published in February 1976, took quiet satisfaction in that recognition, noting that the world was at last understanding what happened in Holland in September 1944, and no longer thinking of it as solely a British story. The story of Matthew B. Ridgway in Operation Market Garden is not ultimately a story about a single battle. It is a story about what happens when institutional politics overrides professional judgment, when the most qualified voice in the room is excluded from the decision that defines the outcome. Ridgway did not need a fabricated confrontation with Montgomery or an invented quote from Eisenhower to secure his place in this history. The documented record is sufficient. The man who walked a road that armored vehicles refused to drive. The man who canceled a suicidal mission hours before takeoff. The man who, 12 months later in Korea, took command of a collapsing army and turned it around in 60 days. That is who they left on the sideline in September 1944. If you had been Eisenhower in September 1944, knowing what you now know about both Ridgway and Browning, who would you have put in command of Market Garden and why? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.